hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Society. First, I'm just going to say a few words about what the Platypus Affiliated Society does, after which I'll introduce the panelists in the order in which they'll speak, and then I'm going to read the panel description, and then we can start the discussion. So the Platypus Affiliated Society organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism based on the problems and tasks inherited from the old, new, and post-political left for the possibility of emancipatory politics today. We publish our open submission monthly called the Platypus Review, which you can find in the back for free. And we also have a weekly reading group here at LSE, and we meet in 20 Kingsway in room 211 from 6 to 9 p.m. And we have a weekly coffee break at LSE from 5 to 6 on Thursdays at LSE Garrett, which is a cafe around the corner. In the back, you can also find the Socialist Standard for £1.50, and also the Weekly Worker for £1. We also have a reading group at Goldsmiths University, and they meet on Mondays from 6:30 to 9:30, and they have a weekly coffee break on campus on Wednesdays from 6 to 7. But more information can be found on our website, platypus1917.org. So today our speakers will each give some opening remarks, after which they will have a chance to respond to one another, and then we'll open up the discussion for questions from the audience. On that note, I'm going to introduce the panelists. So we have Jack Conrad in the center of the Communist Party of Great Britain and a regular writer for the Weekly Worker. We have Adam Buick of the Socialist Party of Great Britain, to his left. And on the right, we have Robin Halpin, translator and propagator of the ideas of Exit Group in Germany, with particular interest in situationist value dissociation critique. Okay, so I'm going to read the panel description then, and then we can just start. How's that sound? This panel invites you to reflect on the history of social democracy from a leftist viewpoint. Such a perspective raises the spectre of the Socialist Second International, the Marxist political organization that led the workers' movement for socialism around the turn of the 20th century.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Yeah. In the United States, this politics found its expression in Eugene Debs, a radical labor leader converted to Marxism in prison by reading the German Marxist Karl Kautsky. In Germany, in Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, Communist Party of Germany, inheritor of the Spartacus League's opposition to joining the German state's war effort during the First World War, and in Russia, most famously, in the capture of state power by the Bolshevik Party, led by Lenin. Thus, the Second International gave rise to what is arguably the greatest attempt to change the world in history, the revolutions of 1917 to 1919 in Russia, Germany, Hungary, and Italy. In these revolutions, communists split from social democrats, the latter of whom formed the bulwark of the counterrevolution. During much of the 20th century, a Marxist-Leninist approach to history prevailed on much of the hard left, according to which the Second International revolutionaries had effectively superseded the politics of a more right-wing figures within social democracy, such as Kautsky. The Third International has in this respect been widely accepted as an advance upon the Second. In the 1930s, the rise of fascism seemed to sideline the communist social democrat controversy. A generation later, after World War II, these same social democratic parties in the West engaged in wide-ranging reforms, while still opposing communism in the East. For a few decades of supposed convergence between East and West, it seemed that the earlier evolutionary view of achieving socialism contra communism might be proven correct. But the new left in the West emerged in opposition to such reformism, in search of a more radical politics. The new left saw itself as in keeping with the earlier revolutionary tradition, even with significant changes offered to it. In the neoliberal era, however, the division between reform and revolution has been blurred, if not erased. Today, by contrast, social democracy is on the defensive against neoliberalism, even while its memory is resuscitated by such phenomena as Syriza, Podemos, Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders. But do we in fact need to reckon with the earlier history of Marxism, the split between communists and social democrats, in order to understand the problem and project of social democracy today? How are the questions of social democracy and social revolution today related in light of history? What has social democracy come to signify politically?
Excuse me, I didn't quite catch the gentleman sitting on the right. Was it just the
Oh, Adam Buick from the Socialist Party of Great Britain.
That's me.
Yeah. So, Jack?
Oh, sorry. Okay, thanks very much. Okay, well, I suppose it's worth...
Could you reintroduce yourselves?
I thought we've just been introduced. I'm Jack Conrad, member of the Communist Party of Great Britain. And I write it in the Weekly Worker. If you want a copy, you don't need to pay £1. If you want to pay £1, that's great by me. And if I'm 10 minutes each, is it, roughly?
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Okay, if I get towards 9 and don't look like shutting up,
I'll tell you.
great.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's just begin, I suppose, not with socialism, but with what Marx preferred to call himself, and that is that he preferred to call himself a communist. I'm not sure, maybe one or the other speakers, maybe both, will tell us, you know, when Marx actually came round to communism. Maybe it was 1843, but whatever the date was, previously he looked at what had been called communism and said it's not scientific enough, whatever, but it's quite clear that he came round to communism and he attempted to put it on what he would have called, and what I would call, a scientific basis. What he meant by that is that instead of dreaming about communism and imagining a future where everyone would be wearing X, Y or Z, it was a materialist communism based on the reality that he found himself in the 19th century. In terms of the word communism, I don't know when it has its origins. I presume it's Greek. You can read Josephus, a contemporary of Jesus' brother in Palestine, talking about the communists and how they want to free the slaves and create equality. You can read Plato. It obviously goes back way deep into history. On the other hand, as I understand it, the term socialism was new. I don't know exactly when, but I think it was actually 19th century when the term was invented. Certainly, in terms of the sort of this sort of particular discussion, the word social democracy was definitely 19th century. And if we look at Marx's followers in Germany, I don't know who first did it, but certainly they began to call themselves social democrats. And you can read Karl Marx, I don't know whether he was writing to Engels or whatever, but I think it was Marx that called it a pig of a name. And the reason, of course, he didn't like the word social democracy isn't because he was opposed to democracy in the 19th century, but the project of Marxism, the project of communism, is to actually get rid of the state. And Marx viewed democracy as a form of the state. And therefore, the word social democracy as encapsulating our aim was quite clearly not ambitious enough as far as Marx was concerned. Nevertheless, what's in a name? You know, he can live with it. I can live with the word socialism. I prefer communism. We all have problems in terms of these names, though, given the history, not so much of the 19th century, but the history of the 20th century. And quite frankly, whether you want to call yourself a socialist or a social democrat, or I don't know, a democrat, or a socialist, or whatever, we all are carrying an awful lot of baggage, and we all have to spend quite a lot of time when people ask you, well, what do you believe in? Then in saying, well, I believe in this, but I don't believe in that. I don't know any way around it. I think Lenin said somewhere or other, I don't know whether it was in 1918 or something like that, we could call ourselves the party of, I don't know whether it was fluffy pink elephants, or for the party of angels maybe, and soon the word angel would become a bad word. So we basically have to live with what we live with and take the consequences. Okay, let's just move on then. So Marx in general, when he talked about socialism, he tended to use the word in a negative way. Yes, he had the word working class socialism, but if you look at the Communist Manifesto and lots of other things that he wrote, he's really talking in the negative. So the Communist Manifesto has what? Conservative socialism, reactionary socialism, Catholic socialism. Later he talks about military socialism, bourgeois socialism, etc., etc., etc. There's lots of socialisms that Marx does not like. Okay, let's just get to the Second International. The Second International, I think, has had a bad history in terms of modern Marxism. There's plenty of stuff that's there to be criticised. I certainly don't want to repeat the history of the Second International, not least when it comes to 1914. Nevertheless, as the introducer said, here was an organisation that consisted of many hundreds of thousands of workers. Here's an organisation, I think, that we can say that in terms of capitalism, if we want to name one organisation that was responsible for what we can call the democratic breakthrough, I would name the Second International. It's funny, I find it really bizarre when we take the ideologues of capitalism that they join together capitalism with democracy as if the two go together. I've been at enough jobs in my life, but I've never experienced a boss who turns around to me and says, "Jack, capitalism is so democratic, we're going to have an election and we're going to elect the boss." I've never experienced it. I've never experienced a situation where they turn around and say, "Yeah, let's have a vote on how we distribute the profits." Never had a vote when it comes to sacking people or firing people or any decision. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong. No, the fact of the matter is, if we take capitalism, it's an anti-democratic system. It's a system of exploitation of the few, of the many. And if we look at the origins of capitalism, and we look at the history of capitalism, it's a history of actually opposing the extension of democracy. And the impulse to extend democracy has come not from above, but from below. I think that's been the history of capitalism. And as I said, I think the Second International was decisive, at least in Europe, in making that breakthrough. Okay, now let's deal with maybe the different. I know I have differences with Adam here. Actually, our exchange in the Weekly Worker began actually when we both took the same side in condemning the idea that market socialism was something to aspire to or represented some sort of healthy stage which we should aspire to. We both rejected that idea. I have to say that in terms of how I use the word, and I'm not insisting on it, I just have to explain how I use it, I take as my starting point Lenin, I know we've got a copy there, State and Revolution, which is, what, September-ish, 1917. He breaks off at the end, I think, says, "Oh shit, can't finish this pamphlet, I've got to go out and make the revolution." But within that pamphlet, he says that basing himself on Marx's critique of the Gotha program, this is the program out of the Unity Congress of the German Social Democracy in 1875, he says there are two stages. We can't just go straight to communism, we can't just get rid of money straight away, we can't just get rid of the state straight away, we can't just get rid of classes, bang, straight away. There's got to be a transition period. Marx called it the first stage of communism. That's my memory. of it. Lenin said, okay, the first phase of communism, I'm going to call it socialism. And certainly that idea was common amongst Marxists in the Second International. So you can find Stalin, who was a very obscure social democrat in Georgia, writing his pamphlet, Socialism and Anarchism, 1905? Something like that. You can see him writing along those ideas. The reason why he was doing it is not because he knew anything about 1875 and the literature, in terms of some contemporary. He knew about it because German social democracy rewrote its program. We've just been asking Adam what date it was. He thinks I'm wrong, but I don't know. I'm going to go for 1895. They rewrote their program in 1895, and as part of that, they republished Marx's notes. And this became common knowledge throughout, I suppose, the North American social democratic socialist movement, and certainly the European socialist movement. Okay, last few minutes. What about today? Well, I've already said that we've got a dreadful history to explain, but I think explain it we have to, and why, in spite of that dreadful history, why am I still a committed Marxist, someone who believes in socialism as the first stage of communism? Well, I look at capitalism. I don't think it's the last word in civilization. I think it creates a basis for human freedom, but it cannot deliver human freedom. And I think human beings, by their very, how should I put it, by their very nature, aspire to freedom. And what I mean by freedom is not some anarchist freedom or some capitalist freedom of no social responsibilities, or, I don't know, everyone has their own island and everyone can go into space and travel up to the moon and, you know, what they're saying, 40 million tickets now, $40 million to go into space. That's not what I mean by freedom. I mean by freedom the full development of each individual, but that is preconditioned on the full development of all. That's what I understand by freedom. That's what I understand by communism. Okay, Soviet Union, I don't think had anything to do with socialism, I would say, by 1928. The first 5-year plan, to me, marked a complete rupture. If you look at it before that, I think you had desperate people clutching on in an extraordinarily desperate situation, breaking their own program, hoping upon hope for something to come to rescue them. They originally banked on the German Revolution. The German Revolution didn't come. I don't know, I think I've read in Trotsky that if Stalin knew what he'd turned into in the mid-1930s, he would have shot himself. And I sort of, I can go along with that. So what about today? The word socialism, I think, has been reduced to some sort of meaningless piece of twaddle. You know, if you listen to Jeremy Corbyn, basically socialism means being nice. Justice, equality. Well, we all want justice, don't we? We all want niceness. But this is nonsense. So to me, Jeremy Corbyn is putting forward the idea of pretty much a tinkering with capitalism. You know, I don't think that's got anything to do with the socialist project. Ditto Syriza, who've just become an agent of austerity. Whether you thought that was always the case, I did myself. Just look at their program. Again, I don't think this has got anything to do whatsoever with socialism. This is just about reforming capitalism. In essence, they are no different, you know, from Ramsay MacDonald or Clement Attlee, except today the bourgeoisie hasn't got the same fear of the working class. That if we look back to the Second International, yes, this embodied hundreds of thousands of people. Today, socialism has been reduced to an idea, but it's an idea, just like Marx's idea was in the early 1840s, that is based on the objective realities of capitalism and where the working class has to go if it's to find freedom. That's my call for now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I'm Adam Buick. I'm representing the Socialist Party of Great Britain. Actually, we're quite well qualified to speak about the Second International because we're a breakaway from it. So we're, if you like, pre-Leninist Marxists. We don't accept Marxist-Leninism. We, in fact, were a breakaway from the Social Democratic Federation in 1904. The Socialist Party actually sent a delegation to a Congress of the Second International in that year. But when we found we had to sit next to Keir Hardie and people like that, we said, no, this organisation is no good, we're having no more to do with it. Anyway, what is socialism? And what did the parties of the pre-First World War, Second International mean when they said, what we want to put in place of capitalism is a socialist system of society? Well, in 1893, William Morris, who himself had been a delegate to a previous Congress of the Second International, he took the initiative to have draw up a manifesto of English socialists. And this is what they said here. On this point, all socialists agree. Our aim, one and all, is to obtain for the whole community complete ownership and control of the means of transport, the means of manufacture, the mines, and the land. Thus we look to put an end forever to the wages system, to sweep away all distinctions of class, and eventually to establish national and international communism on a sound basis. Now, the fact that this manifesto was signed by such non-Marxists as George Bernard Shaw and Sidney Webb, what it shows is this, that at that time, the disagreements between reformists and revolutionaries, between possibilists and impossibilists, was not so much over the aim, the sort of society they wanted to see established, but as to how to get there. Now, in the Communist Manifesto, which has already been mentioned, Marx and Engels, they shared this idea. They didn't invent it, they got it from groups of workers that they'd met in Paris and in Manchester, who called themselves socialists or communists. Now, this is reflected actually in the text of the Communist Manifesto, where Marx talks about the communistic abolition of buying and selling, where he endorses the thing put forward by the people you forgot to mention, the critical utopian communist socialists. He endorsed their view that it should stand for the abolition of the wages system, and also the view that the state should be converted into mere superintendents of production. So what you're talking about, the definition of socialism, is a classless, stateless, wageless, moneyless society based on the common ownership and democratic control of the means of production by and in the interests of the whole community. That's what socialism meant at the time. And that's also what socialism meant to the parties of the Second International. You can read this, any of the tenors of those parties who are still read today, such as August Bebel, Karl Kautsky, Rudolf Hilferding, Rosa Luxemburg, and even by Bolsheviks, such as Alexander Bogdanov, Stalin, and Lenin himself. They all had this conception of socialism. What they regarded socialism as being what the Germans called a natural economy, which is one where goods are produced purely and simply to be used, not to be sold on a market, not to be bought. Now, I'll back this up with a quote from, first of all, August Bebel. Now, August Bebel was the actual face, if you like, of German social democracy. Kautsky was just an intellectual theoretician, the editor of their theoretical newspaper, but August Bebel was a worker who was popular amongst other workers. He wrote a book called Woman and Socialism, and part of that book is a description of future society. This is what he says, one of the things he says about future society. It does not produce commodities to be bought and sold, but produces the necessities of life that are used up, consumed, and have no other purpose. And he goes on, there being no commodities in the future society, neither can there be any money. And for the benefit of our Bolshevik friend here, here's what Alexander Bogdanov, this is a book called The Short Economic Course of Economic Science, which was used as a textbook by the Bolsheviks, both before and after their seizure of power. This is what he says. The new society will be based not on exchange, but on natural self-sufficing economy. Between production and consumption of products, there will not be the market buying and selling, but consciously and systematically organised distribution. So this, to say, was the common view as to what socialism meant at that time. Now, on this question about the term socialism or communism, when the Communist Manifesto was first translated into English in 1888, Engels wrote a preface, and in this preface he explains why it wasn't called the Socialist Manifesto. And the reason was that at the time, in 1848, the word socialism was associated with all sorts of utopian projects by people who rejected the working class struggle for political power as the way to socialism. But the implication is that had the Communist Manifesto been written in 1888, it could easily have been called the Socialist Manifesto. In fact, it would be much better understood if it was called the Socialist Manifesto, which is why Engels had to make this point. What this shows is that words socialism and communism were used interchangeably by Marx and Engels and the other members of the Second International. Now, the big change in the meaning of the word socialism, the decisive break with previous practice, came in 1917, when the Bolsheviks were preparing to seize power. Up until then, the Bolsheviks, apart from the question of organisation, they'd been orthodox social democrats. They shared the definition of socialism I've just given, and they also shared the view that a socialist revolution was impossible in backward Russia. And when Lenin returned from an exile in Switzerland in April 1917, he shocked even the members of his own party when he declared that from now, the immediate aim of the Bolsheviks is to seize power, not to complete the bourgeois revolution, which had been their previous policy, but for socialism, or a socialist revolution. Now, there was people in Russia who still adhered to the previous definition of socialism. They said to me, what do you mean? You can't have socialism in Russia. It's too backward. Well, Lenin had a quite clever and dishonest answer. What he said was this. He said, you're talking about communism. I'm talking about socialism. Then he went on to talk about and this brings us to the question of the scientific difference between communism and socialism. Well, nobody even thought there was a difference between socialism and communism before, let alone a scientific distinction. Now, it's true, as Jack has mentioned, that in 1875, Marx did talk about a first phase of communist society and a higher phase of communist society. But he could equally have talked about the first phase of socialist society and the higher phase of socialist society. But the important thing is that there were phases of the same society. There weren't two different societies. There were phases of a society based on, well, as I say, classless, stateless, moneyless wages society based on the common ownership and democratic control of the means of production. There were two phases of that society. But Lenin, he didn't, in his definition of socialism, he didn't even have the same view as the Marx's first phase of communist or socialist society. And this is a quote from The State and Revolution. And this is his word. He's talking about the correct functioning of the first phase of communist society. This is, I'm quoting from him directly now. All citizens are transformed here into hired employees of the state, which consists of the armed workers. All citizens become employees and workers of a single nationwide syndicate. All that is required is they should work equally, do their proper share of work, and get paid equally. So this is not the abolition of the wages system, which all people who call themselves socialists in the Second International have stood for up till then. this is the continuation of the wages system. It is, in fact, state capitalism. The wages system under new management, state bureaucrats instead.
Could you wrap up the microphone?
No, because I was told I could speak for 15 minutes, and I prepared to talk for 15 minutes, if you don't mind. I'd like to continue.
So spend time.
Yeah. No, as I was saying, so it was state capitalism, which in fact is what the Bolsheviks eventually went on to establish. I mean, Lenin said this in 1918. It's already well talking about 1928. Right from 1918, Russia was state capitalist. Now, I've got to hurry things up. But what happened, of course, is because the Bolsheviks stayed in power, and because they they had a certain prestige amongst military workers, and of course because they had this big propaganda machine of the Russian state behind them, they were able to, their definition of socialism, which is really state capitalism, was able to triumph, and hence the confusion that exists now. Now, you're going to stop me. This isn't a meeting to discuss the failings of Bolshevism. This is a meeting to discuss the failings of social democracy. So what were the failings of social democracy? Well, though they had as their objective socialism, say a classless, stateless, wageless, mayorless society, this wasn't their only aim. This, as far as they were concerned, this was their ultimate aim. This was them, they called it the maximum program. But they also had a minimum program, which was a program of economic, social, and democratic reforms to capitalism. And it was on that basis that they thought and got support, including at election times. What this meant was they were the prisoners of their non-socialist supporters and electors, and eventually they became simple bourgeois democratic reform parties. Now, one social democrat who pointed this out was the so-called revisionist, was a revisionist, Edward Bernstein. He said, look, this is what we are. You might as well come out and recognise that that's what the German Social Democratic Party is. It's a bourgeois democratic party of reform. Now, this was rejected, but it didn't make any difference to the situation, nor to the practice of the German Social Democratic Party. But of course, what finally demonstrated that these parties had been built upon an unsound basis was the outbreak of the First World War, when the members of the Social Democratic Party in the Reichstag, they voted for the war, while their counterparts and equivalents in France voted, they joined a coalition of national unity. After that, it's been downhill all the way. After the First World War, the Social Democratic parties of Europe frequently participated in bourgeois coalition governments. In fact, Bernstein was vindicated. But they claimed, or their theoreticians claimed, that what they were trying to do was to gradually transform capitalism into a different type of society. But of course, what happened was the opposite. They gradually got transformed into parties which are no different from those that were competing against at elections. It didn't even claim to be socialist. They claimed to be better managers of capitalism than their rivals. Of course, when they got a chance, they frequently failed. But I have to say, I agree with what Jack said about the Labour Party, but he'll have to, well, buy his paper. I'm sure it says vote Labour in the election. So, you have to be logical on this. If you're against social democracy, you should be opposed to it. Now, I'll say something briefly about, this will be the end, this is my peroration. What should we do today? Well, what we should do today is what William Morris said, actually. Make socialists. What we should do is shout, not keep socialism under a bushel, but shout from the rooftops. We are socialists. Socialism is the only viable alternative to the capitalist system, and socialism provides the only lasting framework within which the problems which capitalism throws up can be dealt with. Now, if we don't do this, if we just, otherwise, what's politics going to be? What's left-wing politics going to be? We don't regard ourselves as left-wing. Well, what would left-wing politics be? Well, what it is, an endless series of demonstrations and protests, not even now to get more reforms of capitalism, but to stop existing reforms being taken away. Now, this is no way to a socialist society. if you are a socialist, what you should be doing is proclaiming and promulgating socialism, which is what we in the Socialist Party do. Sorry about that, but I was given 15 minutes.
Right, thank you, Comrade Chair. This is going to take about 12 minutes. Right? So, what is socialism? When I first read the invitation to speak this evening, I puzzled not a little over the title of the meeting. Not the words themselves as such, but rather the grammar. For how are we to read the word is, the present simple tense of the verb to be? For there is no obvious referent in today's world that exhibits the being of socialism. Reading further in the invitation, I saw that what was really meant by socialism was in fact social democracy. So the puzzle over the missing present tense referent remained, and this for very good reason, because the moment of social democracy has been and gone, having been weighed in the scales of history and found wanting, sorely wanting. The core defect of social democracy was always its dependence on the state as the means through which socialism was to be realised. All the bitter quarrels in the history of that movement revolved primarily over questions of the state and how communists and socialists were to orient themselves towards it. Was the state a neutral instrument or one of class power? Could the existing state be captured by the organs of the working class and used to implement socialism? Or did the existing state have to be smashed, only to be replaced immediately by the party state? A different state, to be sure, but a state nonetheless. These bitter quarrels then ranged over such matters as participation in elections and the relationship between the socialist state and other organs of working class power, such as trade unions and workers' councils. Given this hegemonic statist mindset, anyone rash enough to question the very need for a state in the first place was derided as suffering from an infantile disorder and placed beyond the pale of civilized discourse as an anarchist or council communist. This mindset cemented itself after 1917 with the Bolshevik seizure of power in Russia, and a year later with the accession to office of Social Democrats in Germany. But only cemented itself, for its origins lay in the very roots of the social democratic project. So, what then is wrong with treating the state as an instrument of social transformation? To answer this, we need to look at an essential relation, often overlooked or just taken for granted, and that is the relation of the state to the nation. For all the talk about the relation of the state to the working class, the far more important relation to the nation has been neglected. For what is the state, if not the central body through which the interests of the nation cohere? And this is true of any modern state, be it a Western imperialist state, a state on the capitalist periphery, or more ominously, a Soviet-type party state. But then again, the nation does not stand as an autonomous entity, but as one nation among others in a world of cutthroat capitalist competition. Each state must look out for its own national interest in this dog-eat-dog world of competing nations. With competition taking place continuously on the economic level and on the strategic military level. The ability of the state to reconcile different class and group interests within the nation, or even of a socialist state to implement a socialist program, all takes place within the framework of this competitive struggle. Now, looked at like this, we can see more clearly the sheer horror of socialists aligning themselves with a state, any state. In order to be credible as a party holding state power, social democrats had to show their complete loyalty to that state in its struggle to advance its own interests in a world of states. Of course, this is easier for regimes of the Soviet variety, for the party is the state, and so defending the party, the state, and the nation all amount to the same thing. When we see this as the reality confronting social democracy, the catastrophe of 1914 becomes easier to understand. Social democrats, and this applies to Henderson as much as Kautsky, Jaurès as much as the majority faction of the Mensheviks, had already, long before the outbreak of war, thrown in their lot with the state and came to its defence in its hour of need. This rapturous acclamation of patriotic feeling was not some kind of betrayal, as Lenin claimed, but the perfectly logical outcome of their underlying political theory. Thus, through the war, what I call iron triangle of party, state and nation cemented, and through the party the working class was inducted into the sanctum of the political nation. The political theory that had been taught to the class by the party now becoming melded with the ideologies of patriotism and national salvation. It is true that Lenin, to his credit, rejected this logic of nationalism and its call for war, but not the underlying statist politics that informed it. As was to be shown a few years later when, upon forming his own state after the Bolshevik coup d'etat, he proceeded to pursue the same logic of national interest in his dealings with other states. The true nature of party, state and nation then received its first outing in the war he initiated and pursued against the newly emerged Polish national state, where he encouraged Russian workers and peasants to go and slaughter their Polish counterparts in yet another vicious war of conquest. What I believe was at work with Lenin and those Bolsheviks and Menshevik internationalists who opposed the war was their recognition that the pre-modern Tsarist state was not the kind of instrument that could allow itself to incorporate social democracy in the way that states of the advanced capitalist countries could. A state socialist program could only be implemented in Russia after the overthrow of the existing state apparatus and its replacement with a social democratic party state. Once this had been achieved, the same logic of nation and state was bound to assert itself. And so it did. With this history, and understanding the consequences of social democracy's relation to state and nation, we can see just how empty phrases such as socialist internationalism are. In fact, the term is an outright oxymoron. Social democracy demands of the working class that it defend the nation heart and soul, and that includes demanding that workers of one country go forth to slaughter the workers of other countries, so that social democrat fights social democrat. Of course, all in the name of bringing socialism to the workers of each country. As the bitter war ground on and the older bourgeois political parties became discredited as the working class recoiled from a barbarity in which they were expected to do the killing and the dying, it was social democracy that kept the masses in line, both at the front and in the industrial cities. And so, for connoisseurs of dialectics, there occurred a fine example of dialectical inversion, whereby the party started out as depending upon the state, and then the state ended up depending upon the party. In the century since then, social democracy, whenever it has held office, has consistently pursued policies of strengthening the nation's position in its competitive struggle on the world market. And everything they have done in terms of industrial strategy and constructing welfare systems has been done with that objective in mind. Again, I say this is emphatically not any kind of betrayal, but the perfectly logical outcome of their strategy. Why then did social democracy as a statist strategy collapse at the end of the 1970s? This comes back to my problem with Why do we say, what is socialism? The true reason is that it had fulfilled its historical mission. The working class was now fully integrated into the nation, and its political consciousness saw its interests as identical to those of the nation of which it was now a part. What then can be said of attempts to reboot the whole enterprise, as is being suggested by some people today? I can only claim that the notion is utterly quixotic and doomed to failure, for in whatever form it takes, it will again be dependent upon the state for its fulfilment, and the same logic of statist politics within a context of international competition will force it to defend national interests. Even if it were to nationalise everything and eliminate the privately owned corporations and banks and set up democratic institutions for the control of these things, it would alter precisely nothing in the fundamental constellation of power. The problem facing any such social democratic enterprise is part of a larger problem facing anyone wanting to be a political force in the world today. For the whole sphere of the political as the arena in which competing interest groups within the nation settle their differences and share out the spoils of capitalist exploitation is quite simply dying on its feet. This slow but inexorable death is not due to subjective factors alone, although these two have their place and show how little social democracy actually did to settle competitive differences between classes, genders, races and religions. No, the important reason is objective and has to do with the nature of a mature capitalism in the wake of the Third Industrial Revolution, or microelectronic revolution. Capital, always crisis-ridden from its own inner nature, has entered into a period of terminal crisis as the capital relation itself comes up against its own absolute intrinsic limits, which result from the driving out of living labour from production through ever-increasing automation of industry, without, for the first time in capitalist history, there being a compensatory expansion in markets arising from new productive industries that can absorb the labour being cast out of the rationalised sectors of older industries. The upshot of this is a massive shortfall in realised surplus value that forms the lifeblood both of new rounds of expanded reproduction of capital and of the revenue available to the state for purposes of social welfare and infrastructure spending. This hard fact remains totally under-theorised in current Marxist thinking, which tends to look at the state in purely political terms, as a struggle of competing wills, while neglecting the political economic structure of the state, which, since the inception of capitalism, has been a tax-gathering machine, creaming off a portion of realised surplus value that may be used for the state to pursue its own ends. In plain language, there simply is not the money, and I mean real money, as realised surplus value, and not fictitious capitals generated within the financial sector. This is the true root of austerity, in contrast to superficial explanations that rely on ad hominem arguments about greedy financiers and spiteful Tories. To attempt to pursue a social democratic programme while ignoring the fundamental truth that redistributive struggles at the political level are quite simply no longer feasible, or in other words, that the political sphere itself is dying on its feet, means that political actors condemn themselves to irrelevance. I would go as far as to say that parties formed on the basis of classical social democracy are little more than historical reenactment societies. Their antics might be amusing to watch, but have little to do with bringing about real social change. So, where do we go from here? Well, I do not claim to have an alternative that I can just put on the table. Before anything like that can happen, an enormous amount of thought and theoretical clarification must be done. This is something that leftist groupuscules have always shied away from. But it has to be done, for we can no longer take our theory off the peg from the past. I was very pleased to hear that Adam spoke well of William Morris. I find that very unusual in the context of these kind of discussions. I want to end with a few words from William Morris. He was a true Marxist and an enthusiastic student of Marx's great work, Capital, who has never been treated with anything like the respect he deserves from the leftist milieu, who've taken nothing from him but the wallpaper. I have adjusted his words slightly to allow for the inherent sexism of 19th century speech, but this is what he wrote. I pondered all these things, and how people fight and lose the battle, and the thing that they fought for comes about in spite of their defeat, and when it comes, turns out to be not what they meant, and other people have to fight for what they meant, under another name, and that is our task, nothing less.
So now the panelists have 5 to 10 minutes to respond to one another.
Yeah, oh, okay, right, you know, I thought we were going to go to sponsors before, but okay. Right. Well, there's interesting contributions in terms of either side of myself. First of all, what I would say is that, well, I would defend the Bolsheviks. I would call myself a Bolshevik, I would call myself a Leninist. If one wanted to push me, I don't mind calling myself a social democrat, but again, it does depend what one means by a social democrat. Quite clearly, these words have changed. Okay, if we look at what Adam was saying about Lenin, for me, what Lenin was saying in 1917 was utterly orthodox Marxism. Utterly orthodox Marxism. And what he actually said is not, we shall now proceed to have the socialist revolution. What he actually said is that what Russia could do is actually make steps in the direction of socialism. And of course what he meant by socialism precisely was, as he explains in the pamphlet that Adam quoted from, is something that he took from Karl Marx in 1875, where he wrote that the communist project begins where capitalism is, any capitalism. So what Marx explains is, yes, of course, our aim is to get rid of money, is to get rid of the state, is, how should I put it, the full development of each and all the rest of it. But precisely what you have in the first stage, first phase, in the lower phase, call it whatever you will, is a state. That is orthodox Marxism. It was the anarchists that turned round and said, the state is going to be oppressive, the state is going to end in disaster. The real question that I've got for Robin is, okay, we can look at the history of the 20th century, and I'm going to be the last person to say everything was fine, it all went according to, how should I put it, the agenda that we mapped out. But okay, here we are we actually going, when we seize power, or come to power, or whatever the particular idea is, are we going to turn around to the capitalists and say we're not going to use any force? And my answer to that is, well, that's just plain daft. That is, to use a phrase, simply utopian. So we do begin with the state, but as Marx and Engels famously explained about the Paris Commune, this is a different state. It's an anti-bureaucratic state. It's a state in transition to ceasing being a state. That is the idea. Now, I asked myself, if we go back to Lenin, what did he actually believe, in October, November, call it whatever you will, 1917? What we do in Russia, we seize power, we're going to be left in isolation, we're going to starve, the working class is going to dissolve in terms of they either die and they join the Red Army and die, or they go back and they become peasants. We're going to be isolated. No, the whole strategy is precisely based on the German Revolution sparking off the European Revolution. So it's not based on what it became, it's precisely based on the perspective of turning what had been an imperialist war, yes, into a civil war against our own ruling class. Now, Adams' version of social democracy, I know we've only got X amount of minutes, but I think it is worthwhile investigating. The idea that it is so simple, that on one side there was Lenin and the Bolsheviks and the Menshevik internationalists, Martov, and these were the guys that were against the war. Well, let's just look at Germany. I mean, did Lenin and his strategy base himself on, well, there's official social democracy, they're backing the Kaiser. There was another social democracy that had gathered mass support. Began, you could say, with Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, but it became a mass force. Not just with the German Communist Party, which began as a tiny organisation, but the independent Social Democrats. And if we look at what was going on in Germany, it was quite clearly not the case that all German workers were loyal to the Kaiser state. What you had is mutinies, in that sense copying, being inspired by what was going on in Russia. That's just the historical fact of the matter. So in that sense, I would take what I would view as a lot more of a nuanced view about 19th century or 20th century, and I'm talking about pre-1914 social democracy. In my view, you can argue that Bernstein, yes, was being perfectly logical for Bernstein, but if we actually look at this guy, Karl Kautsky, just a theoretician, or for that matter, Bebel, we don't know what Bebel would have done. He died in 1913, didn't he? We can guess. I don't know what he would have done. We know what Kautsky did. And in Lenin's view, and I know obviously Robin disagrees, he betrayed his own program. If we look at international social democracy, I mean, I'm not saying I back the particular slogan, but their slogan was, if the bourgeoisie, as everyone expected them to do, launch a world war, we will have a general strike against the world war. Lenin's slogan was actually, well, this is nonsense, but what we need, yes, is a civil war. We need a revolution against imperialist war. I don't think myself that Lenin was an exception there. I don't think that Lenin, in that sense, said, oh, we've got a Tsarist state. I do remind you that after February, we are living through the 100th anniversary, Tsar Nicholas abdicated. Who became the government? Well, you know, I won't tell a long story, but amongst the members of this government who Lenin did not back were thoroughly modern social democrats in the form of the Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, and other such people. Lenin did not back that state. He continued to oppose that state and called for his comrades in Germany to do the same thing. So I don't think your history quite stacks up, let alone when it comes to what the hell do we do? Because you can talk about, I've got no wish, by the way, to wait for a wintry day and storm Buckingham Palace or you know, a reenactment society, right? But in terms of the past, I don't think that we want to just wipe the slate and say that there's nothing valuable there. To me, you've already been quoting Marx, you've looked at Capital. To me, effectively what you're saying when it comes to organisation, when it comes to programme, is forget the past, let's begin anew, but what the hell do we begin with? You've talked about the necessity of theoretical investigation, but theoretical investigation with what tools? By the way, tell me when I've talked far too long.
I think
that will do, eh? That will do. Yeah. I think that's enough. Well done. That's enough. Okay, thanks very much. It's your turn.
Yes, would you want to stand up?
No, sit down if you want.
Okay. Can you hear me at the back? No, I just want to take up the last remark you did, the quote from William Morris, it was from A Dream of John Bull, I think. But William Morris was, like us, broke away from the Social Democratic Federation to form the Socialist League on exactly the same sort of grounds. The Social Democratic Federation in Britain was reformist and undemocratic. But in fact, the Socialist Party has always had a high opinion of William Morris. One of our first pamphlets was this thing, Art, Labour and Socialism. But if I'd bought all my pamphlets, we could have had two other ones that we published. But to come to your point about social democracy, or reformism, and gradualism, if you like, the Labour Party in this country and the Social Democratic parties in other countries, they thought that there's a national solution to social problems, but there isn't. I mean, capitalism is a worldwide system, and it's the international capitalist system which causes problems. So if they get power, state power, within one particular country, what they can do is limited. Then they can't just introduce more and more social reforms. They can't increase social benefits. They can't increase wages. Because what that would do would be to undermine the competitivity of the capitalist industries in that country on the world market. So this has always been a restriction. Every, Jeremy Corbyn is just Harold Wilson Mark II. I can remember the Harold Wilson government, and they started, we're having a national plan, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. They abolished prescription charges. Within a year, what did they have? They brought health charges back again, and they had 2 devaluations. This has been the fate of all social democratic and Labour-type governments, which have tried to reform capitalism in the interests of the majority class, or essentially by working class. What we mean by it is everybody who's forced to work for a wage or a salary, which is about 90% of the population, not just industrial workers. The fact is that capitalism cannot be reformed to work in the interests of the majority working class. So everything you say there about why social democracy fails and why it's even worse today, I hinted at that in the end by saying that what reformists are doing today, people that go along with reforms, what they're doing today is protesting about reforms being taken away. They're not even campaigning for new reforms to be brought in. I suppose we can go back to the 1970s and have arguments about what Lenin said and what Lenin did and what Lenin was wrong. But all that is old hat. There's never going to be another Bolshevik-type revolution in Western capitalist countries. It was never on the cards anyway. But what Lenin did in 1917, he knew he was going to be, if he seized power, he'd have a problem of how to organise industry and how to organise production. And what he looked to was not what Marx had written in it was 40 or 50 years previously. He looked to the German war economy. And he said, that is what we should, that's the model we want here. We want a state monopoly-controlled economy. But instead of it being controlled by the Junkers, it should be controlled by the Bolshevik Party. So right from and he actually said in 1918, this is the way forward. State capitalism is the way forward for Russia. And he said it again. They had this bit of war communism when people thought money was going to wither away and so on. What happened was they had to give this up in the end. And in 1921, they adopted the new economic policy. The new economic policy, what was it? It was the development of capitalism under the control of, he called it, the proletarian state. It was the development of capitalism under the control of the Bolshevik state. And of course, you give him the standard justification as to what, why he thought he could get away with seizing power in the name of socialism. He was expecting a socialist revolution in Germany. A socialist revolution in Germany was never on the cards. What was on the cards was a democratic revolution. So if you like, the German Social Democratic Party achieved its aim. It overthrew the Kaiser state and it established a democratic capitalist state in its place. I mean, Ebert, who was one of the people who supported the war, he got up and he proclaimed that Germany is now a republic. And that was a revolution that took place in Germany after all. So Lenin made a complete miscalculation if he really thought there was going to be a socialist revolution in the West at that time. Now, I don't want to come across as a defender of Kautsky, but Kautsky did not support the German side in the First World War. And he was, in fact, a member of this party, which the independent Social Democratic Party. He was, if you like, just a pacifist opponent of the war. But he wasn't, I mean, if you read Lenin, Kautsky is the biggest traitor since Judas Iscariot, but I mean, it wasn't that bad at all.
Right, thank you. Yes. Well, how are we going to stop our enemies from retaliating against us if we don't have a state? I mean, this argument I think I've heard 1,000 times. Well, certainly organs of some kind must be created for the purpose of preventing the violent crushing of a revolution or of a new social order. But these will, I think, have to be in the nature of ad hoc organisations which dissolve after their function has been fulfilled. Because if they concretise themselves into a central state organism, then you're stuck with that right to the end of your social formation. There's no such thing as the withering away of a state. Any state that can cohere itself makes sure that its prime function is to stay in existence. So any kind of state, any kind of central state apparatus will cohere the economic order of society around it and with the aim of maintaining itself in power. So if you set up a state, any kind of state, you're stuck with that and you don't get to communism. I think that is really my main point there. Stuff to do with the Russian Revolution. I think it's true probably that some, at least of the Bolshevik figures, perhaps Lenin himself, did really believe that a revolution in Russia would spark a revolution elsewhere in the West and primarily in Germany. There was never any hope of that succeeding. No advanced capitalist state has ever been overthrown by, as it were, a frontal assault by its own working class, ever in 200 years. And if it didn't happen after the horrors of the First World War, it's hard to imagine how it could ever happen. I believe that revolution will come about through the collapse of the capitalist order because of the increasing dysfunction at the political economic level. And I've noticed in this discussion that I'm the only one who's raised the relationship of the state to the underlying political economic order of society, and that's something that I think is often overlooked in these discussions, as if politics was a completely autonomous level of activity that had nothing to do with economic realities. And I don't think that that's very helpful in getting us to concentrate on the future of capitalism and how to make communism. Right. I think that's all I've got to say about that, man. Thank you.
Okay. So let's open up the conversation for discussion. I'm going to use my privilege as the moderator to ask the first question. So my question is going to be about the present, but I'm going to be talking about I'm going to start by talking about what my understanding of Marx and Engels' understanding of social democracy is.
Can you speak up?
Yes, I will. So it seems to me that for Marx and Engels, the potential in social democracy was the potential of the proletariat's leadership, of the reconstitution of the democratic republic, which was the result of the bourgeois revolution, and to go beyond it and overcome it on its own basis. By contrast, often on the left today, I think that the working class is actually an object of administration. Seems to be rackets in production, or worse, an aggregate interest group. And it seems like today, for many on the left, the distinction between socialism and democracy, the relationship between socialism and democracy seems blurred. And so I'm wondering why it is today that for many, Stalinism or the welfare state seem to mean social democracy. Those things are the same. And then relatedly, I guess a concrete example of that is, for instance, like no, yeah, I'll move on to the question, but the main part of the question, which is that in the present, right, like, in terms of the Labour Party and people trying to transform it into a socialist party, what kinds of potentials are there in that with, for instance, like momentum? And why is it the case that Lenin could have believed in 1920 that labor entryism was a win-win situation? And why in the 1930s, when the CPGB was rejected from the party, the working class wasn't convinced of the labor leadership's bankruptcy? What's changed between 1920 and 1930, and what has changed from 1920 to 2015? Another way of putting that question is actually, what is the potential, if there's any, in Corbyn? So yeah, that's like a bunch of questions to put on the table, but if you guys could respond to those, each of you, and then we'll go to the questions from the audience.
Shall I go first? Or?
Let's go reverse order.
Okay.
Yeah.
Your questions were all in one sort of block. Can you just sort of give me just a couple of bullet points, what you'd like to know about?
Right, so what's the potential that you see in Corbyn? What do you think about momentum?
I mean, sorry. This is, we are supposed to be talking about what is socialism. Corbyn, the Labour Party momentum have got nothing whatever to do with the question of socialism. They're a bunch of state apparatchiks who have claimed to have a better way of administering the state, which means administering the working class, and of fighting the battle of international economic competition than the Tories. It's nothing to do with anything that Marx or any other revolutionary, communist revolutionary ever thought of. In that sense, nothing is Marx to Corbyn and momentum. And also, I would say this, even on their own terms, outfits like that, little rackets like momentum, have got no future whatsoever. We've seen this. There was an upsurge in membership and engagement in the first few months after they're founded, and then it fizzled out. Why? Because that upsurge was just a little bubble in the middle-class leftist intelligentsia of North London, and once they'd all been recruited, there's nobody else, because nobody else is interested. What's the next bullet point?
I guess the other one would be, why is it that for many, Stalinism and the welfare state seem to be equal to social democracy?
Well, because every leftist organisation has told us that for almost a century. Sorry, but, these things, it's been... people who call themselves Marxists, all kinds of other socialists, have always said, this is it, this is socialism, this is how you do it, this is the real deal. And of course, liberal and conservative publicists, I wouldn't call them intellectuals, publicists, have just been laughing their heads off for most of the last century. And people could actually buy into believing that this crock of shit was actually amounting to a transformation of society. Yeah. That's why, because we've been told it. Yeah? Yes. What was the other one?
The other point was, like, what's the difference between, like, 1920 and today? Right, like, why do you think there was a potential in the Labour Party?
Okay, right. That refers to what I said towards the end of my talk, the very structure of capitalist political economy. In 1920, in fact, the whole interwar period could be seen as one large drawing in of breath on the part of the capitalist system before its last final massive expansion. The interwar period saw the construction of new mass production industries, an enormous expansion of the working class. This carried on, of course, through the war and into the 1950s and 1960s. So you had this expansion of the working class, the spread of modern capitalism. But what you have now is the opposite process, a process of decomposition. And that is the main difference now. That obviously, strategies based upon an ever-increasing volume of living labour seemed to have a lot of relevance in decades where productive industry was expanding on a massive scale all over the world. But well, now we're seeing the opposite happening all over the world, and living labour is being cast out of productive industries. So the underlying political economic basis of these kind of strategies of mass working class organisation are dead or dying. That's what I'd say.
So we're not going to the opposite.
No, Adam next.
Okay. So you want Adam?
Yeah.
Well, you're in charge. It's not me. So.
Yeah.
So, yeah, right, me. Right, okay. Right, questions. Well, first of all, I just wanted to pick you up. I mean, I'm not quite sure, because obviously, I'm just listening to you the first time. Democratic Republic. My understanding, certainly when it comes to Marx, Engels, is what they meant by the Democratic Republic is not the United States as it is now, not France as it is now, let alone a monarchy like we live under in Britain that supposedly is a democracy. I don't think it is a democracy. What he meant by the Democratic Republic is something that the working class fights for, and the other word that he used in that context is, for us, the Democratic Republic is the dictatorship of the proletariat. Of course, what he meant by the dictatorship of the proletariat was not a minority, was not unmediated force and bloodshed. It simply meant, at the time, for him and Marx, was the rule of the majority. That is what they understood by the Democratic Republic, or the dictatorship of the proletariat. Labour Party. The Labour Party has never been a socialist party. I think the Congress you're referring to, 1904, wasn't that when the Labour Party, the debate, was round about then, when the Labour Party applied to affiliate, and there was a debate about whether it should be allowed to affiliate. Karl Kautsky says, well, it will start to become a socialist party. And I don't think that's entirely wrong, looking at it at the time. Lenin, on the other hand, also actually seconded that particular motion, but they were all agreed that it was not any kind of socialist party. They had hopes that it would develop in that direction, but quite clearly it was a very strange party. It had trade unions affiliated to it, and certainly before 1918 it wasn't even committed to whatever the hell we want to call it, state capitalism or anything. It was simply committed to some sort of liberal, reformist program. As to today, well, my view, I'm not quite sure about the Socialist Party of Great Britain, but my understanding of Adam's party is that he wants to transform Parliament, and I would share that view. I wouldn't say that I would base my view on it has to be transformed, but I would certainly take the view that we need a programme to transform it. I would extend that to the trade unions. I would extend that to every sphere of existing society. We want to transform existing society, and certainly when it comes to the institutions of the working class, no matter how perverted, no matter how inadequate, I would include the Labour Party in that. I can't really see why there's a problem in that perspective. It's quite possible that that will fail, okay, but not to try, to me, is a fundamental mistake, and that's why I disagree with Robin. I mean, looking at Corbyn and say, oh, it's nothing, it's nothing, it's nothing. Well, what is anything then? What is the significant movement today in a country like Britain? I mean, I would certainly look at what's going on in the right of the Labour Party. I would look at what's going on in the establishment. I would look at generals going, Jesus Christ, Jeremy Corbyn. Yes, I think something's happening. Not to intervene, I think, is a sort of armchair version of socialism. And certainly when I listen to Robin, I mean, okay, here you are, I'm not saying we are, but here you are in 1914, I'm not saying Robin would do it, but I can imagine him saying, Jesus Christ, they're all going to war. Millions will die. Oh, no, comrade. Let's not go for a civil... Let's not try to overthrow our own ruling classes. Yeah, our parties voted for that, right, 2 years before, but what we'll do is wait for capitalism to collapse. To me, that's not really much of an answer. To me, the lesson of the 20th century is not that it had to be like that. It's very easy to look at past history and say, well, it had to be. It's obviously quite a strong argument. This is how things turned out to be. But simply to look at things as they turned out to be, I think takes a one-dimensional view of history. History is full of all sorts of different possibilities which we can analyse. And the idea of a German revolution was impossible. Well, again, you know, as a theoretician, if I could have told the German working class, or if the German working class could have been persuaded, well, who is it? Clara Zetkin. What is fascism? Fascism is the punishment brought upon the working class for its failure to carry out a revolution. If they'd known what would happen in 1933 or 1943, anyone who turns around to me and says, oh, well, they would have waited for capitalism to collapse. I don't think that is something I would recognise in terms of Marxism.
See, the title of this meeting is What is Socialism? We've now come to the second part, what is not socialism? I mean, socialism, we'll go through it, socialism is not nationalisation, socialism is not government ownership, socialism is not what existed in Russia or Cuba, and socialism is not the Labour government. That's what socialism is not. The only thing I said, I described what socialism originally meant. Now, over the years, it's changed partly under the influence of the Bolshevik regime in Russia, which said this is socialism. They made state capitalism into socialism. This is accepted by lots of people inside the Labour Party. Now, everybody said, I don't say it's a proper shite, the Labour Party, but it's not a socialist party. It never has been a socialist party, and it never will be a socialist party. The socialists shouldn't join the Labour Party or shouldn't have anything to do with it. It's a reform party which thinks that you can make capitalism better for workers, and you can't. So the Labour Party is a waste of time. I've never voted for the Labour Party. I'm sure Jack probably has, but that's up to him if he wants to vote for it.
So where do you go to argue for socialism?
Huh?
So where do you go to argue for socialism?
Well, I've been at Hyde Park, and I'm here.
Hyde Park?
Yeah, I've been at Hyde Park. I'm standing for the council in this year. So, and this brings the second point. There's not going to be a civil war. I mean, do you know what a civil war is? Look at Bosnia. Look at Syria. That's what a civil war is. That's not going to be the way to get to socialism. It wasn't the view of Marx and Engels. Even in the 19th century, Marx and Engels thought it was possible under certain circumstances to have a peaceful transition to socialism. They were in favour of a democratic republic. They were in favour of universal suffrage. And they said that under certain circumstances, the socialist-minded working class can use universal suffrage on the vote to win control of political power, and then use that to abolish capitalism. So before they were socialists, both of them were Democrats, bourgeois Democrats. So, I mean, all this talk about going back to, which century are we living in? This is what, the 21st century? We're not having barricades and white guards and red guards on horseback fighting each other. I mean, that's not how a socialist revolution is going to come about. It's going to come about when a majority of people want and understand it and organise democratically to achieve it. I mean, let's be realistic about this. Let's say one final thing about what Robin says. He says that capitalism is in terminal crisis. He's saying that capitalism will collapse. I don't think it will, but if it did, and there isn't a socialist majority, then the result is not going to be socialism. It's going to be, I don't know what it's going to be, but I don't think, in fact, that I think capitalism is probably a lot more resilient than you give credit to. I mean, you mentioned 1920. In 1920, somebody called Herman Kahn, I think, wrote a book out called The Collapse of Capitalism. He said capitalism was going to collapse in the 1920s. Jimmy Maxton of the IOP in the 1930s, he said capitalism's only got a few weeks to go. Capitalism is still here. Capitalism won't collapse because it'll just stagger on from crisis to crisis until people decide consciously to put an end to it. So that's
Hi, thanks for everything so far. I think I want to just try and push a bit more some of the things that have been coming up here. Different ways or different emphasis that's happened from different speakers in their kind of attempts to articulate a dialectical relationship between capitalism and socialism and between party and state. So I think there was an interesting point near the beginning where Jack was talking about Marx and Engels and the coining of the phrase social democracy, and you mentioned how that socialism itself as a word kind of came up in the 19th century, which I think is significant historically, and then that social democracy was to disarticulate from democracy, because democracy was seen as a form of state, and later on, and then there's also been this kind of question about that Nunzio was sort of raising about the working class and the continuation, but also transformation of a bourgeois revolution. So interested to hear more from all speakers about their perspectives on that. And I think that relates to this other set of issues that have come up about lower stage of communism and higher stage, or if you call it, or in Lenin's terms, socialism versus communism, but also that, and Adam was saying how the thing about lower forms of communism and higher form is that it's a continuation of the same form of society that's changed from the previous form of society, whereas Jack was trying to somehow show the need for how to get to a changed society from the standpoint of capitalism, then which I think brings up this question of it brings up the question of working class and continuation of the bourgeois revolution and dictatorship of proletariat, and also this question of the role of parties. And for Robin, there was a kind of negative characterization of this relationship between party and state in terms of the failure of struggles for socialism in the 20th century, and the party becoming dependent on the state becoming dependent on the party. But it's interesting that we brought up that distinction, because it seems to be that relationship between party and state, because I think possibly for the other two speakers, the role of the political party in the struggle for socialism is a kind of central question. So I guess if I could just hear more from each of you on those questions, the relationship between capitalism and socialism and party and state.
Can I go? Another batch of that? Right, there's an enormous misconception been prevalent on the left for a very long time due to... This is partly Marx's fault. Not everything Marx wrote can be let through without criticism. And that bundle of ideas which goes by the name of historical materialism is one of them. There is a line of thought running through Marx's mature work, where he's melded Hegel's theory of history with Adam Smith's economics in terms of seeing succeeding stages of history. And he attributes a far greater logicality to the unfolding of successive stages of history than, in fact, can really be maintained. The coming of capitalism was not in some way the logical outcome of the decline of feudalism. In fact, it was a massive catastrophe that followed on the collapse of the feudal order. A massive catastrophe for almost the entire, for all human populations that were caught up in it. So there isn't this logical progression from pre-capitalist forms of social order and the capitalist order, and also, crucially, there is no sense of logical succession from capitalism to a communist social order. It has to be a total break. And that's why I would say to the comment you made earlier, Lucy, about the dialectical relationship between capitalism and socialism. Well, the relation there isn't dialectical. It's, in fact, it's simply negation. Right? It's not a unity that self-differentiates to separate poles. It's something absolutely separate. The construction of socialism, the construction of communism, I prefer to say, is something that goes ahead, that is far, far more than simply taking over the existing order and running it ourselves. There's, so there I would say, looking at history, it's important that we take a critical stand and distance ourselves from the norms of historical materialism, which way over-logicize the movement of history. That would be my answer.
Well, I would take a very different view, as you might expect. I mean, first of all, I would say that we can very easily, living in certain countries like the United States, Britain, maybe, you know, Western Europe, I'm not quite sure of the statistics, forget that the working class is actually rapidly expanding on a global scale. I can't remember, I think it was in The Economist I last read the figure, but the number of wage workers on a global scale, they were saying, has expanded to something like 230 million. I actually agree with Robin in terms of who are the working class. Of course, in Britain, what workers do is very different to what they used to do, but certainly I would take the view that 90% or whatever the hell figure one wants in Britain are working class. In terms of productive labour, though, as I said, it is actually expanding. And that's why I would certainly take the view of this stuff that we used to hear. I don't know whether people still hear it, post-industrial society. I mean, I look around, I came here by tube, you know, I've got bits and pieces that are presumably produced by industry all over me. I wear stuff that's produced by industry. I really don't get that idea, especially when it comes from socialists. So to me, yes, socialism comes out of the contradictions of capitalism. Crucially, the existence of an ever bigger class of workers. And again, if we look at how governments manipulate that, we had this stuff, didn't we, with the Chancellor Hammond, talking about the self-employed. How many self-employed people are unemployed people on government schemes in Britain today? Anyway, all I'm saying is yes, to me socialism, communism comes out of the contradictions of capitalism. Crucially, I would say this is why I look to the working class and not just to some idea, well, this would be a good idea. To me, communism isn't just a good idea, it actually is a historic movement I do believe in historical materialism and all the rest of it. Just a couple of other things, perhaps. I stand for peaceful revolution. Any Marxist, anybody who says, we want a violent revolution, I think is an idiot. The real question is, do we bank on it? Do we say, well, there is only the possibility of peaceful revolution? I would say, well, that is crazy. I don't think that we can preclude the possibility that they will use violence against us. We will be the majority, but they will cling on. Ditto in that sense, okay, we have what Robin said, we have an ad hoc army. Well, my memory of the Red Army when it was formed, it was very ad hoc. It also lost every engagement with the counter-revolutionaries. And what would have been the result, you know, if the counter-revolutionaries had got to Petrograd? What would they have done? I don't think it's unfair to compare that with the sort of horrors that the Nazis unleashed in Germany and in Europe. So yes, of course, we all want an ad hoc state. Sometimes life is not so generous to us, and that's the point I would emphasise. Is there anything else to say? No, I think that would... Sorry. Okay. Well, I think a party is an absolute necessity, and what I mean by a party is not, and this is, okay, I call myself a Bolshevik, a Leninist, is not the sort of party that, in my view, the Bolsheviks and Lenin were forced to become after 1917. I don't view that as this is what the model is that we should aspire to. Ditto, in that sense, the model of the Third International. They believed that we were on the edge of an international civil war, and parties therefore had to be organised militarily. And we see the problem with that, not only in the party that I used to be a member of, the official CPGB, we see it around us in the lack of debate, the lack of thinking, the hierarchical nature of so many parties in Britain and on a global scale that call themselves socialists today. In Britain, the Socialist Workers' Party, a completely rigid, top-down party, socialist party in England and Wales, and one can carry on with those sort of parties. In my view, parties, yes, need to be united in terms of agreed actions. Meanwhile, there should be an encouragement of debate. There should be an encouragement of thinking and investigation. Not something one can say that is characterised, the present-day left is characterised by. In terms of the state, my view would not be, I don't know about Robin, I'm not quite sure of the SPGB. Oh, sorry, Adam, sorry. Sorry, Adam. My view certainly is not that we should aim to take hold of the existing state. In my view, you can use the word smash, you can use the word dissolve, you can use whatever metaphor one wants, but we want to basically disperse the existing armed forces. We want to get rid of the judges. I'm sure Adam would agree with that, but we do not have the strategy of taking hold of the existing state, certainly, and using it for our own purposes. So I agree with Adam that socialism is not about nationalisation, and one can carry on with the list. Can I just say finally on that, that in terms of how Lenin used the word state capitalism, this is applied to conditions of Russia when there is starvation, when they are in isolation, and when they are beginning with an economy that basically has ceased to exist, and the vast majority of people have gone back to individual peasant agriculture. It's not something he's aspiring to. I readily admit that his model was Germany, World War I Germany, of course, again.
Well, I don't think anything wrong with the materialist conception of history. I think it explains both the transition from feudalism to capitalism and the transition to come from capitalism to to socialism. I mean, it's to do with the development of the means of production and different classes coming into existence which have an interest in changing society, changing the basis of society. Now, capitalism prepares the way for socialism. Capitalism has become an international system. Capitalism has developed the means of production to a point where we can have plenty for all, if not abundance for all, if society was reorganized on a different basis. And there's a group of people in society today, 90-95% of people were forced to work for a wage or a salary to live. It's in their interest to get rid of capitalism and replace it by socialism. Now, the way to do this is, in our view, to organize politically. Now, that is what we envisage by party. Party isn't something separate from the working or from socialism. The party is the working class organized politically to get rid of capitalism and replace it by socialism. So, opposed to the idea of a vanguard party which is going to lead the workers, opposed to the idea of a parliamentary party which is going to lead the workers. Workers have got to organise them, themselves to democratically to get rid of the system. And of course, once you've got a majority in favour of socialism, okay, if there is a recalcitrant minority of mad capitalists and mad generals that want to oppose the overwhelming will of the majority, we're not going to let them get away with it. I mean, we accept the old Chartist slogan, peaceably if we may, forcibly if we must. I mean, we're not there yet, so that's not an immediate problem. So you get the majority of people who want and understand socialism. They've organised themselves democratically. They win control over the existing state, and they lop off all the undemocratic features. Get rid of the House of Lords, get rid of the Queen, get rid of judges and all these sort of things, and have a democratic thing. But, of course, this didn't last very long at all. How long is it going to take to displace the capitalists? How do they own the factories now? They've got pieces of paper, they've got legal pieces of paper, stocks and shares, bills and bonds, which say, this is my private property, and the courts will enforce it. Okay, we say, okay, from now on, all bills and bonds, all stocks and shares are worthless. They will not be enforced by the courts. So what happens? The workers organise and they take over, and you run into the capitalists can't do anything about it. Now, on this other question of what happens straight away after socialism has been established, I don't think actually Marx used the word lower stage and higher stage. I think he talked about the first stage. Clearly, maybe in the first stage of socialism, when it's been first established, it won't be possible to go over to full free access, the full implication of the principle, from each according to their ability to each according to needs. Maybe there will have to be some sort of restrictions on consumption, because the priority is going to be, if socialism was established now on a world scale, the priority is going to be stopping starvation, stopping people living in slums and shanty towns. But that will be society already based on the common ownership and democratic control of each production. Society without classes, a society without the state, a society without money, without people working for wages. And if you like, gradually, and in this case, it can be introduced until you very rapidly reach a stage where you can have, from each according to ability, to each according to its needs. But of course, I should answer your question about the party and the state. After the working class has abolished the monarchy and the House of Lords, the next thing they abolish is the Socialist Party. You don't need a party in the socialist system or something. Why would you need it? It only serves for one purpose, and that is to gain control of political power and to use it to get rid of capitalism. So there'll be no Socialist Party in the Socialist Society. There'll be no party. We wouldn't need them.
John in the back with the glasses.
I've got a crazy idea that it might not be a bad thing in a discussion of what is socialism to quote Marx's one-sentence definition in the class struggles in France on what is socialism. It says socialism is the declaration of the permanence of the revolution, the class dictatorship of the proletariat as the necessary transit point to the abolition of class distinctions generally to all the production relations on which those class distinctions rest, to the abolition of all the social relations that correspond to those relations of production, and to the revolutionizing of all the ideas that correspond to all that came before. Now, if you think about that, if you think about what Marx is talking about, you think about the tremendously lopsided distribution of the productive forces on a global scale. You think of thousands of years of the division of mental and manual labor, patriarchy and everything else, the division of society in the nations. And what is a state? This is one of Marx's key insights. A state represents and reinforces all that, all those divisions and hierarchies and so on, right? So the question, Robin, as opposed to your fantasy world, is not do you need a state? You will have a state as long as all these divisions and so on exist. The question, it's not whether you need it or not. It's there. The only question is it a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie that's reinforcing, reflecting and reinforcing all that? Or is it the dictatorship of the proletariat that's trying to do away with all that? And it's going to take generations. One of the lessons we learned from the 20th century is exactly that. This is not Marx. Look, he's in the 19th century. He didn't have, he hadn't seen it. The first thing he saw was 80 days of the Paris Commune. That's all he had. That was his total experience of revolutionary power. It's going to take generations to uproot all those inequalities and divisions and so on. Okay? So, look, your idea, ad hoc, how are we going to deal with the attacks of the bourgeoisie, invasions, ad hoc groups of guerrillas? Oh, okay. They did that in the Paris Commune. It got drowned in blood. That's why the Marxists came up with the idea of vanguard party and state power. In order to deal, you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You're throwing away lessons that are precious that need to be. Last point, Jack, capitalism is an anti-democratic system? No, it's not. It's a bourgeois democratic system. The capitalists like bourgeois democracy. They don't like proletarian democracy. And that argument opens the door to your idea about transform parliament, use parliament, and so on like that. You don't want to seize the ready-made state machinery, but you're going, the main way the bourgeoisie absorbs and buffers all the existing class struggles is exactly through bourgeois parliamentary system. And so you may not want to lay hold of ready-made state machinery, but all you're doing is preparing the oppressed to go into an arena where they're going to be disarmed.
Was it a long sentence?
That was Marxist. The rest was mine.
So, panelists, who wants to do first? Roger? Let's do Adam's first.
I think your quote was something from Marx wrote in 1848, 1849. Yeah. Well, Engels in 1895 wrote a preface to a reedition of that pamphlet. And in it, he said, look, we were wrong. We thought there was going to be an immediate proletarian, rather immediate bourgeois revolution followed by a proletarian revolution. And he said that the days of barricades and street fighting of conscious minorities leading unconscious majority, those days are over. And he said, he said, look, okay, we've got now universal suffrage. The German Party, he was wrong. He had illusions about the German Social Democratic Party. It was winning elections and getting more and more votes, and he had the illusion that this would eventually lead to that party coming to establish social. But I mean, that quote that you gave, part of it, perfectly reasonable. That's what socialists aim at: to get rid of capitalism and to uproot the state, uproot the wages system, and provide the framework that all these problems can be lastingly solved, because it won't be an economic system. You won't have economic laws of no profit, no production, can't pay, can't have. All those won't exist once a socialist system of society has been established. So just make that point that Engels, in fact, didn't refute it, but put it in its historical context. I mean, 1848, you said Marx only saw 80 days of the Paris Commune. Marx never saw a telephone, I don't think. He never saw a radio. He never saw a motor car. He never saw a nuclear. They were all plastics. I mean, he was. That's you know, things have moved on since that time. The means of production have developed much more, which means that we can easily go over straight away. Once people want it, we can go over to a socialist or communist system, call it what you want. We don't need transition periods and transition societies and so on. Well, in fact, that's what's happening now. The transition is taking place now. When people's ideas are gradually changing in a socialist direction, that's the transition.
Robin?
Yes, well, I mean, in fact, we're just going to have to disagree on the question of the state. I can only reiterate the point that if you start off with a state, then you're stuck with a state forever. And as a self-perpetuating machine that sets itself up above the rest of the population, well, you're going to be stuck with that, and if you've got that, you don't get communism. It's true, I can't lay out any alternative scheme about how to deal with problems of the transition, and it's true that neither I nor the people I work with have thought those things through yet, but we do know that if you try to do it in that same way as it's been done before, you will end up with the same sort of situation. Right? You will either end up with some form of capitalism being restored. Well, you will end up with a form of capitalism being restored. The question is whether or not it's private capitalism or state capitalism.
Jack? Yeah, okay, thanks. Well, again, bourgeois democracy. To me, it's real, but it's a contradiction in terms. And I certainly don't look at things in terms of historically that the bourgeoisie, when they talk about democracy, mean it for you and me. To me, the fact that I can speak here without being taken away by the police has got nothing to do with the generosity of the capitalist class. It's got everything to do with the strength of the democratic impulse which comes from below, crucially in Britain, from the working class. That's to me how I've looked at history, how I understand history, how I understand where we are today. In terms of Parliament, well, again, we're not so far away geographically from Marx and Engels' house, where, as I understand it, Marx, Engels got together, who was it, with Lafargue and someone else in Engels' front room up in Regent's Park Road, and Marx outlined the programme of the French Workers' Party. And one of the stipulations in it, and the purpose of it was to win his people and to win the mass of workers precisely to organise in order to get representatives in Parliament. That was Marxism. It was the anarchists that said, we don't want anything to do with Parliament. We don't want anything to do with parliamentary action because that is corrupting. And as Adam said, you know, if we look at German social democracy, whatever was wrong with it, yes, it not only stood for Parliament and got some people in Parliament, the crucial thing about standing for Parliament is it allowed them to organise the working class into parties, into trade unions. It allowed them to be strong. Yes, you can again make the argument, look what happened to the parliamentary representatives, but again I can turn around and say, well, look what happened to the Bolshevik parliamentary representatives. And if we're talking about conducting parliamentary work, yes, the Bolsheviks conducted parliamentary work, not because they had any illusions in the damn Duma, not because the Duma was democratic. As I understand it, the workers were allowed 6 representatives, the intelligentsia, was it 7? I can't get the figures right. The aristocracy, I don't know, 100. The priesthood, 100. It wasn't democratic, but it allowed the Bolsheviks to put out propaganda. It allowed them to produce papers that were directed to the working class, and it allowed them to organise the working class. So I don't agree that if we look at what the Labour Party is or what German social democracy became, It was inevitable from that style of work. After all, if we look at everything in terms of the history of the 20th century, none of it worked. You know, in terms of it worked. I agree with you. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But let's not pretend that, one, everything works this way or nothing works the other way. We've actually got to examine critically the history of the 19th century and the 20th century. That would be my approach to the question. So, to me, proletarian democracy, it is the impulse that the working class had back in, what, the 1830s, 1840s, with the Chartist movement, that had the demand, one man, it was man, I think, at the time, one man, but we would say one person, one vote. The question is, what do you do with that vote? If it just becomes you vote Labour, Tory, Liberal, Scottish Nationalist, or whatever, okay, that's not going to get us anywhere. But if they start to vote, if we can persuade people to vote for a socialist party, I think that's a different thing. And I don't simply say that the 19th century socialism was impossible, the 20th century socialism was impossible. To me, the horrible situation we're living through at the moment is our failure. You might be right. It might take several generations. I don't know. But to me, we should be aiming for things to be as quick and as bloodless and as civilized as we can possibly make it. Meanwhile, yeah, let's prepare. What was the slogan again? Peacefully if we can, forcibly if we must. The old Chartist slogan.
Great, thanks. I'd like to follow up on this point about clarifying the first stage of communism, which has been mentioned by most of our speakers, and it has been said it could be called socialism, or as the gentleman back right said, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Adam said that Lenin got the wrong conception of this stage because he thought it would be the state employing everyone, and that doesn't get rid of the wage system, which there seems to be some agreement that overcoming labour as a commodity seems to be the aim of communism. Now, Robin mentioned the collapse of feudalism as a catastrophe, but the self-conception of the bourgeois revolutions was that they were replacing the feudal social relations with social relations based on labour. As the Abbé Sayers said, the third estate was nothing, but it will be everything. The increasing obsolescence of labour, as Robin has mentioned, however, still leaves social relations based on labour and people's demand for their bourgeois rights. My understanding of Lenin's text-state revolution, which has been mentioned as well, is that even when all the capitalists have been appropriated by the dictatorship of the proletariat, the problems would continue because the workers, who are equally functioning on bourgeois ideology of labour, would be demanding their bourgeois right. So, given that, why did Marx think that there needed to be a transition period, as Engels put it, a semi-state that would wither away, and what would its function be?
But, I mean, I hate this sort of argument where you argue what Marx said, what Marx didn't say. But you know, I got used to doing this in the 1960s and 1970s, when there were lots more people claiming to be Marxists and so on. Now, there's a logical flaw in what you say. You said that the lower first phase of communist or socialist society is the same as the dictatorship of the proletariat, but it can't be. Because if it's a phase of socialist or communist society, there's no longer any proletariat, there's no longer any classes. If in fact you read that thing, Marx has, if you like, three stages. One is the revolutionary transformation of capitalism into socialism. That's the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Once that's over, there's no more state, there's no more proletariat. We've got socialism or communism. I mean, that's how I understand what what Marx was saying in that. And it seems to be what I would say now is that period, so-called dictatorship proletariat, which is not a very good phrase anyway, because people misunderstand the word dictatorship, can be got through very rapidly. He was writing in 1875. He'd never seen all these things I mentioned before. That particular period can be got through very rapidly. Once there's a majority in favour of the changeover to capitalism, from capitalism to socialism, that can be implemented fairly quickly. Why would you do, as I said before, you just sort of say, from now on, capitalist private property rights no longer exist. The means of production are now the property, if you like, or are now available for the democratic control to the whole community. Once you've done that, you've abolished classes. The state doesn't exist. You don't have wage level in that particular pamphlet that we're talking about. Marx actually says labour power is no longer a commodity. I mean, so this can be reached fairly rapidly, I would say. And then you've got socialism. And once you've got socialism, let's say.
So what then is the distinction between in your conception, the second and third stage?
Well, Lenin reflects the first stage, if you like, and the first phase of communist socialism. They all do it. All the Trotskyists do it. Ernst Mandel did it in his book. He invents a new society, never known to the majority of conceptual history before, called the transitional society. In Marx doesn't talk about transitional society, he talks about a transition period from one society to another, which would be more or less relevant, or more or less not relevant. So this is, if you like, gross distortion in the meaning of the word socialism that happened in the last century. The meaning got changed what it originally meant, which is what other people now call communism. That's what socialism meant, and that's what the people up until the First World War meant by socialism, thought they wanted to achieve as soon as possible. As I say, Lenin was in a situation where he knew perfectly well that if he got power in Russia in 1970, he could not establish socialism as it was understood until then. So he had to invent this new definition of socialism, which is state monopoly capitalism, state capitalism, and everybody becomes an employee of the state, paid equal wage. That was never the conception of socialism. I mean, that's state capitalism, basically.
Jack? Yeah. Well, first of all, in terms of Lenin's good old State and Revolution, depending how you read it, my understanding of it is what existed in his head is the idea of everyone being paid, yes, with money. I readily accept that, or tokens, call it whatever, but something that approximates to our understanding of money, but according to their labour time. In other words, if you're a doctor, and I'm useless, whatever I am, we work an hour, we receive from society the same. And that would be viewed as going towards a society that Adam talked about, of where distribution happens on the basis simply of need. In other words, what Lenin was envisaging, which is copying Marx back from 1875, is you begin with some recognition of work done. Work done. Okay. I would emphasise this though. I think it will be, for me, it's a fundamental mistake to take anything in Russia as, hey, this is our model. Right? I would not look at Russia in 1917 and say, hey, this is the sort of society that we need in order to make the transition to socialism, communism, or anywhere. You would not begin with a society that's got 90%, or whatever the damn figure is, of peasants, who are pre-capitalist peasants in general. The only justification of the Russian Revolution is sparking off the European Revolution, of where that transition is possible. In other words, I would then not look at, well, what Lenin really was aiming to do was to establish state capitalism, and we can use whatever phrase we damn well want. Lenin did use that phrase, and what he meant by that phrase is exactly as has been explained, that there is wage labour, but without capitalism. He did not have equal wages for equal amount of time. I think they ended up with, varied at different moments in history, with something like 8 wage grades, something like that. This is expediency, to me, It's not the model. It's not something we aspire to. It's something that happened in history. Can I just say, finally, on the question of the existing state, I think it is worthwhile us thinking, isn't it, about exactly what the Paris Commune was. A lot of people think the Paris Commune sort of came out of nowhere, that it was the equivalent of Soviets, that it was factory committees. Equivalent, what it is the Greater London Council, but with an armed wing. That's its reality. So in terms of thinking about taking over existing institutions, I think that is worthwhile bearing in mind. So yeah, they get rid of the shit and they keep what they need, which is a semi-state, a democratized semi-state. And without that, we are truly in the shit. Can I just, one tiny other point? Maybe Adam's right. Maybe we can all do it smoothly, quickly, almost effortlessly. But on the other hand, maybe we can't. We actually don't know. We are not in possession of a crystal ball. It might be, hopefully, incredibly quickly. Maybe it takes us 3 weeks and we can have a full transition to communism. Maybe. Great.
3 years.
Well, 3 years then. Great. Wouldn't that be fantastic? On the other, well again, we can all compete, can't we? On the other hand, maybe it takes us 50 years. Maybe it takes us 60 years. Maybe it takes us 70 years. Of course we hope not. But we don't know. That's the point I'm making. We do have an enemy against us that is armed, that is prepared to use, and we've seen that in so many different events, to use the most obscene violence against the working class. So I don't think that we can afford rose-tinted glasses when it comes to the transition to a communist society. They will resist and they will use force. Hopefully we will have so much strength that they are not going to do that.
Just a quick follow-up to that. How would we know when or how long it would take? Just like,
Send you a postcard.
if you don't have a response.
All I would say is this, that if you can project yourself back into World War I circumstances where historically there had been a mass socialist movement before World War I don't think Lenin was crazy. That's all I would say. I think that was a realistic gamble. It proved to be false, but Jesus, how the hell can we criticise that? To me, that was a realistic gamble. It was a gamble, but it was a realistic one.
Right, well, all ideas of transition to socialism are, between 70 and 130 years old, all written in circumstances of very different order of things in the world, very different, to use the phrase, level of productive forces, and things politically and economically are very, very different now. I don't even know if these ideas of stages of communism is even remotely helpful. What I would say is that right from the very beginning, from the very first day, you are dealing with a break, a complete break with the ontology of labour. And this is where I'm afraid I must disagree totally with Jack. The idea that what you get is what you've worked for is simply to reproduce the most fundamental aspect of the present society, which is based on the ontology of labour. You don't even begin transforming society unless you've made a total break with the ontology of labour. What people get and what people put in will be then separated into two completely different questions. Now, many people would have said, and will say still today, this is utterly nonsensical, how will we get enough stuff so that we can all eat? Well, this again part of the reason why this is not an unfeasible or utopian answer is precisely because of the enormously high rates of productivity in the industries which provide the needs of society. So it is absolutely possible to break with the ontology of labour. You break with the ontology of labour, you break with money. And you don't have 8 pay scales, stuff like that. You don't even begin the transition to a new society until you have completely done away with the ontology of labour and everything that follows from it, particularly with money. So, you know, you start that from day one and take on from that. What follows from that, I think, is interesting in that it will involve examining every single aspect of this society, of production and distribution processes, of the exercise of power, of education, of ideologies, everything examined and re-examined. Does this contribute to human well-being, or is it oppressive? Is it part of the iron cage of the old society? And you work through everything to transform it. The one point where I would agree with Jack in what he said is that we really cannot know how long it's going to take or when it's going to happen. We cannot lay down a blueprint for the transformation to socialism, but we can say if the power of existing states is broken, we have to move immediately to break with the ontology of labour and the use of money.
Kind of for Robin, I mean, there's a couple of peculiarities that are... Firstly, the state and the nation. I mean, it seems to me that there are almost no national states in the world. This is not a national state. The English, the Scottish, the Welsh, the Northern Irish are themselves like 2 nations, you know. So the Soviet Union, is that a national state? Russia, majority Russian ruled over by a Georgian dictator. The very rarely based on the Maoist comrade who was speaking earlier mentioned that there are all these contradictions that the state has to manage. Well, this is one of them. And precisely, you know, the kind of it seems to me that you're trying to base your theory of the state on as a kind of excrescence of the interests of the nation, but really once you change the definition of the nation to include, you know, Britain as a nation, the Soviet Union as a nation, then you're just stuck with the state is the state and the state represents the state. And again, with the sort of the kind of absolute breaks, I mean, or you trying to apply on the basis of your kind of breaking with the ontology of labour, or did capitalism break catastrophically with the ontology of feudalism? It seems to me that's just not true. There was wage labour in the 12th century in the shipping industry. You know, okay, that's the ontology of labour, somehow kind of also working alongside feudalism. There are long transitions, and okay, whether we logicize them or not seems to be a decisive point. We analyze them, and if the motive forces of capitalism are leading to their collapse, is that not capitalism by its own internal dynamics leading to the possibility of socialism? No bullshit would claim any more than the possibility. We don't think it's inevitable. We all repeat socialism or barbarism a lot. So it seems to me that there's a kind of you're actually deliberately hampering yourself. You want to do all this theoretical work, but you can't talk about long-standing transitions from one side to another. You won't imagine that the state as an expression of actual social relations, but actually only as an internal machine of itself. And I don't see how you can dig your way out of the present on that basis. It's like, you know, Jesus in the desert not being tempted by Satan. I don't buy it. So the question is, what do you say to that?
Well, that was a lot there, James. Thank you. Right, yes. I think you're confusing nation-state with questions of ethnicity and nationality. Let's not forget that what is prior here, logically, is the state, and the state coheres the nation around it. So regardless of whatever ethnic groups originally came under the heel of that state, they are now the nation. So, yes, it's interesting, a little historical excursus into the 12th century. It is true that wage labour went back into the West European Middle Ages much further than people had originally thought. This has been shown by economic historians quite recently. The interesting thing is, though, that as a form of social production, it didn't have the upper hand. It was always secondary or tertiary at the margins in particular areas. We're really talking about that with the coming of capital, we're talking about the generalisation of wage labour. So that's
just to echo, my point is precisely, yes, it's a generalisation. It's not a cosmic catastrophe. It's
well, I mean, if you don't think that wage labour is a cosmic catastrophe, why on earth are you calling yourself a communist? Yeah?
Okay, that's not my point.
Since we're coming up on time, I think let's move on to another question. Is that cool? Okay. In the back, Andre?
Yes. So the term reform was mentioned a few times during what was said before, and Mr. Buick mentioned the minimum program, which was part of the programs of the parties of the Second International. I would like to know of the speakers whether you think that there is a use for something similar to those minimum programs today for a socialist party, or whether you think that the whole idea of a minimum program of capitalist reforms that perhaps point to something else was just wrong by the parties of the Second International.
Well, if I hadn't been stopped in my peroration, that's what I would have said. That what socialists today shouldn't do is make the same mistake that the social democratic parties of the Second International made. And that is trying to campaign for socialism and campaigning for a minimum programme of reforms to capitalism. Because that way, what you do is you attract support, not for socialism, your ultimate aim, but for the various reform measures. I mean, this is still a popular idea now. I mean, he's not here, is he, Mark Osborn, but the Trotskyites, or Trotskyism as they call them, they call the minimum programme the transitional programme. It's all this, it's the same thing. It's a well, in the Trotsky's case, they're more honest than the social democrats. They actually hold it out as bait, or they to try to get people to follow them. But that would be a mistake. What we should do as socialists is just propagate socialism. That's what the Socialist Party is for. That's what socialists do. I mean, nobody else is doing this. I mean, all these other parties, especially if you read the Weekly Worker there, you'll find all sorts of campaigns that are going on, stop this, don't do that, abolish this and abolish that. These are not campaigns for socialism. They're something different. Some of these campaigns are all right, but they're not campaigns for socialism. What a socialist should be doing is, as I say, propagating, promulgating, and putting across the case for socialism. Nobody else is doing this. I mean, the capitalists aren't going to do it. So if there's so few of us around today, that's what we should be doing. We should be concentrating on putting across, as I say, that socialism, as has been defined, that is the way forward. And these reforms, well, they don't work anyway, half of them. And as I said before, most of the campaigns today, which you'll probably see in these papers, they're even worse if Mark Osborn was doing it. They're all campaigns to stop reforms being taken away now. And it's a distraction, basically.
So, let's go on to another question.
Can I jump in on that one?
Yeah.
As a militant defender of the minimum programme, yes, definitely. Because the question is, that, so we've had three people, you have Mark Osborn, and you've quoted others, in terms of who, William Morris. We all accept where we want to go. We all want to go towards a communist society. We don't need to argue about that. The real question is, how the hell do we get there? And in my view, without a minimum programme, you've got no hope whatsoever of getting there. The transitional programme, in my view, of Trotsky 1938 is a disaster, right? Because all it wants to do is kid the workers that all you need to do is campaign to protect your wages, and somehow, almost in spite of yourself, you'll set up and you'll become the state power. And then the Trotskyist comrades presumably turn around to the workers and say, oh, by the way, comrades, you've just conquered state power, and this is now socialism, or it's the transition towards communism, or something like that. That is certainly not what I mean by the minimum programme. The Bolsheviks had a minimum programme, German social democracy had a minimum programme. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were the authors or inspirers of many minimum maximum programme. And if one says, right, oh, these things in the minimum programme, are they not? The 10-hour day, well, that's a terrible slogan for today. Well, maybe not for some workers, or maybe not nowadays, but okay. In the 19th century, when one looks at how long workers were forced to work, the 10-hour bill was a huge advance for the working class. Didn't Marx call it in Capital something like the Magna Carta of the British proletariat, or words to that effect? Votes for women, votes for workers, the Chartist movement, all demands that are technically achievable within capitalism. I readily accept it. But the whole point is, we exist in a society at the moment that there is a working class, but there isn't. There are millions of wage workers, but subjectively, in terms of a class for itself, a class that actually understands its historic mission, that actually views itself as not just part of capitalism, that doesn't view itself as a pressure group or something that's going to get something from Theresa May or Jeremy Corbyn. That does not exist. And therefore, precisely, it's through the minimum programme that the working class can form itself as a class. It's in these struggles to realise its demands for education, its demands for time, its demand to have trade union rights, its demand to have some sort of life within capitalism, that the working class has the potential to transcend capitalism. Without that, it's all hopeless. I'll just say finally this. Robin talked about, oh, we're going to smash the capitalist state. Great. With what? Who's going to do it? You can only smash the capitalist state, I presume, Robin, with something that's prepared to use violence. And the point about that is, already what you've established, if you're on the edge of doing that, is what Marxists call dual power. Right? This is a state within a state. It's unavoidable. We need a mass party. We need mass trade unions. We also need a workers' militia. And if we're going by the classic Marxist definition of armed bodies, that is a state that's waiting to deliver that particular blow against the capitalist system. So I don't believe that we can do without the minimum programme, and nor do I believe that with one decision, oh, we'll have general distribution based on need, that we'll get there. No, we actually do need a transitionary society. Without that, yes, we do risk. We need a transitionary society, that's right, yes. Without that, I believe that we risk barbarism.
And just because of time, I guess we'll go to, unless you want to say something quickly, Robin.
Oh, I just wanted to say something to what Jack said. No, I didn't say, I did actually say that this attempt to frontally smash the capitalist state bound to end in failure, as long as it can cohere some military force around it. Absolutely not. No, the point I was making in my talk was actually that the economic basis of the state power, is crumbling. And the need for the working class to establish organs of its own will come about because the organs through which the society is cohered will have collapsed or be in a state of collapse. That's how I see it. I don't see any future for this idea of head-on military clashes with state power. You're just bound to lose that way.
Okay,
No, this form will collapse.
So, last question. In the back, you still have that question.
It was actually already answered by the answer to the previous question.
Okay, so... David.
Yeah, at the beginning of this discussion, there was a question about the origins of the word communism. According to Marx, I think it's Herr Roth, he says that the communist idea came from the French Revolution via Babeuf, in that it was exported via Buick, whose work was then translated by Bronte or O'Brien. The thing about Babeuf, his programme had two aspects. One was the restoration of the National Convention of 1793. In other words, he wanted some kind of democracy. And secondly, he wanted to abolish private property. Bronte O'Brien, who translated Buonaretti's life history of Babeuf's conspiracy, was a Chartist. The first English translation of the Communist Manifesto was by the Chartists. When Marx writes a critique of the Gotha programme, the first thing he says about it is that its programme regarding it fails to call for the democratic republic, in which case it goes no higher than the Free Trade Liberal Party. With short time, I'm going to flash forward. Rosa Luxemburg's argument against Lenin, or at least one of them, is that Lenin wants to abolish the bourgeois state and without replacing it with anything more democratic. So my question is, who do you prefer, Lenin or Luxemburg, as regards socialist democracy?
Let's go in, let's start with Adam. Yeah.
Well, no argument, is it? Rosa Luxemburg. When Lenin wrote What Is to Be Done, and this is the idea of a vanguard party with a military command and structure. She wrote a thing saying, you mentioned all these French revolutions, saying he's a blanket. He wants to seize power, by a vanguard party. Obviously, there's no contest. She wins hands down if that's the choice.
Jack?
Okay, yeah. Well, first of all, I think it's foolish to counterpose them as if they're opposites. My knowledge of Rosa Luxemburg includes the fact that she participated in RSDLP congresses, including voting with the Bolshevik faction on more than one occasion. It's also worth noting, in terms of Rosa Luxemburg, of course, actually, and this would be my criticism of Rosa Luxemburg, is while she established the Spartacus Bund, it's no party. Where's the party? So in terms of her faction work, where's it going to come from? I think she relies on spontaneity. That's why the German Revolution fails. So I don't think it's a question of democracy on the one side and dictatorship on the other. I think this is a complete misreading of Lenin. And I'm surprised that Adam, I would have thought now, in the period that we've actually presumably mostly read old Lars T. Lee and Lenin rediscovered, this idea that Lenin wanted to establish some sort of military vanguard party is a complete myth. And the problem is that we project back into history, and we project these disputes back into history that weren't real at the time. The reality was that when Lenin wrote his down what is to be done, no one took any notice of it because it was a standard idea that existed on the entire, not just left on Russia, right, but the entire democratic movement in Russia. How did the cadets operate? They had to operate with secret agents. You know, he wasn't laying out much. Can you actually have, under conditions of Tsarist terror, elections of your secretary? Well, if you do, you often elect a police agent. So this is specific to conditions of Russia. It's not a model. And what you get in 1905, when Tsarism wobbles, is the opening up of the RSDLP to democracy. Then there is democracy. And precisely those conditions were over with 1905. It's true that some idiots on the left, including the official communist movement, have looked back and taken what is to be done as sort of some timeless manual of how parties should be organised. I think it's a completely mistaken and bogus view. Lastly, just wanted to tackle this head-on stuff. Do we really think that when Lenin and the Bolsheviks took power, that this was a head-on assault? That there you had on the one side the Bolshevik Party and then the official Russian army. My understanding of the Russian Revolution is it is made by the Russian army. It's made by the Russian navy. The same goes for the German Revolution. The same must go for any revolution. We are the majority class, and we can win over not only our brothers and sisters in their armed forces, we can win over members of the bourgeoisie to our party. So I'm not talking about, here we are on one side, you've got the forces of the proletariat, armed to the teeth sort of idea, there's the forces of the bourgeoisie. This is silly. This isn't even a reading of history, Robin. The reality is that we must strive to win those people to our side. After all, as I understand it, more people died in Eisenstein's reenaction of the October Revolution in the film October. I think 12 people died or something like that in the filming of it, than actually died in the doing of it. This was not a violent revolution, right? In essence, it was a peaceful revolution that was made violent by the whites, made violent by the British. Didn't Winston Churchill, that great Democrat, talk about strangling the Bolshevik baby in its cradle? And damn it, they went to extraordinary lengths towards that end.
The thing that strikes me most about Lenin is that he really saw the project of creating socialism as being something that would be done by his party and his little clique of people alone. It's certainly true that in the conditions of Tsarist Russia, any notion of independent organisation was made impossible because of police pressure. But after the collapse of Kerensky's government in this very well-planned, meticulously well-planned coup d'etat, there was no further need for this kind of secretiveness. And yet, what does Lenin do? Within a year of seizing power, he's abolished the organs of working-class power for no other reason than to aggrandise all power into his own hands. There was absolutely no other reason to abolish the Soviets than that. And if you look at the history of the early years of the Bolshevik Party in power, everything they did was about grabbing as much as they could for themselves without regard to any other force within the working class. Some of these things I've only become aware of recently. For example, in the enormous food crisis of I think from 1919 through to 1922, the one organisation in the Russian working class which could have done something to alleviate the food crisis through better distribution was a cooperative movement which had existed for a very long time in Russia and was very well organised and was totally working class. And what does Lenin and the Bolsheviks say? No, we don't want to have anything to do with you people. You people are going to be wound up. It's all going to be organised by a group within the Bolshevik Party. Consequence, millions starved to death. Because the Bolsheviks, contrary to what's often been written about them, were not very competent organisers at all. Right? So in Lenin, whatever you can excuse about Lenin in the period before the revolution, you certainly can't excuse it afterwards. It was a revolution that was to be made, perhaps by the working class, but simply as foot soldiers who were to march past the podium. It was the party leadership that was going to control the deed. Rosa Luxemburg, on the other hand, now she's much more interesting because she doesn't lay down these meticulous plans of how power is to be controlled. Power is to remain with the working class, and I don't know the details of how she saw this playing itself out, but it's clear throughout her entire writings that if the revolution isn't the revolution of the working class, then it isn't a revolution at all.
So I guess if for closing remarks, just really quickly, I think we have like 5 minutes tops. So if you guys want to say like a couple words on maybe what the prospects for socialism are today, or just summarizing like whatever like you think like you can from the discussion. Let's start with Robin.
Right. Well, the prospects for socialism are grim at best. Any level of socialist or communist consciousness is virtually absent from wider sections of society. There is no sense of anything whatsoever fermenting anywhere in the capitalist world, which shows a line of development out of this situation. But the decline of capitalism, because of the decline of value production, is going ahead at pace and is going ahead very fast. The collapse of capitalist institutions at both the political and the economic level is something that we are beginning to see already, and we will see more of, much more of, in the coming years. It's a question of how people respond to that collapse. And it has to start from people saying, we've got to think outside of capitalistic solutions. People have got to start saying, we don't care where you're going to get the money from, for example. We don't care about how this will affect industry and finance. We want what we need. But at the moment, there's no sign of this happening.
Doom and gloom, isn't it? No, can I just make a general comment on the debate? Because I agree with what you say about Bolsheviks, and also what you say about Labour. I think that one of the criticisms you can make of, for instance, the scheme for Labour Town Houses, it maintains the link between work and consumption. And I think that one of the first things that will end in a socialist society. What people consume will not depend on the amount of work that they do. But I'm not so sure about the whole idea of the disappearance, particularly by Labour. Work will continue to exist in the socialist system of society. That was, in fact, one of William Morris's main points. He wrote a pamphlet called Useful Work versus Useless Toil. What will disappear in a socialist system of society won't be work as such. It'll be wage labour. It'll be employment. Now, at one point, I was worried because I was agreeing with Jackie. He was describing a meeting that was held in not far from here in 1880, when Marx helped the French socialists draw up their programme. And one of the things that this said was converting universal suffrage from an instrument or means of trickery, into an instrument of emancipation. And that, in fact, is in Declaration of Principles of the Socialist Party. But while I was getting worried about agreeing too much with Jack, he suddenly mentioned workers' militias. And I had the idea then of members of the CPGB and Weekly Worker Reader Group doing weapons training up in Forest. I mean, what is this nonsense? Workers' militia. No, it's just crap in my life. Okay, that's it.
So Jack?
Yeah.
Sorry. Sure, I don't want.
Well, to me, in terms of a socialist demand, yes, I want to see the abolition of the standing army, something that's appeared in every genuine Marxist, and I'd even suggest democratic, programme. Wasn't it one of the demands of the American Revolution? Well, I'd certainly stand by that. I don't think that's nonsense. I think it's nonsense to talk about the working class coming to power, right, when we do not challenge the existence of the police force, when we don't challenge the existence of a professional army armed to the teeth. So it's not a question of the CPGB, which is a name of a party, which isn't a party, right, going and training with weapons anywhere. But it is about the idea of the working class organising at every level. And unless the working class organises in terms of its strength, it will get nowhere. And what we stand for, yes, of course there's a workers' militia. That comes out of every vicious strike that history has produced. I remember the miners' strike. And if you tell miners that they didn't need picket lines, they didn't need hit squads, that this is all a load of nonsense, and this is some sort of childish game, I don't think you actually understand the struggle for socialism. If you look at the Paris Commune, did it not have to defend itself? Or is this a childish game? No. Which is something I would want, because I don't want to die, I don't want my class to die. We've got to be strong. And you don't go to the capitalist class and say, please sir, can we have some communism? Because they won't give it to you. In terms of what Robin was saying, I did detect that he sort of backtracked or corrected himself. Not corrected himself, he clarified himself. But what I would emphasise is this. Things look very bleak at the moment. Things can get a lot worse. But what I would say is that that is no guarantee for socialism. Socialism is not premised on the worse things get, the better they are for us. It's the opposite. The stronger we are, the more concessions we get off the capitalist class, and the stronger and more self-confident the working class gets. And that's why, in my previous contribution, I emphasised the absolute necessity of the minimum programme. The working class cannot start thinking in the way that Robin wants it to think, just at the level of an individual. The role of communists, the role of Marxists, is not just to convert one or two individuals. Great, though that is. What we need to do is to win the working class to the understanding that it needs to liberate itself. And it does that through its day-to-day, week-by-week, year-by-year struggles against the capitalist system. And so, yes, I don't think that the idea of a workers' militia or a people's militia is a joke. I think those that imagine that you can get socialism without such institutions, without such demands, that is the joke. That is ridiculous.
Okay, so let's thank our panelists for a lively discussion. Yeah, there's a reservation at Dally's Wine Bar.
Let us move down the corner.
Yes, I was about to say the same thing.